In the before times, the great Titan Cronus received a prophecy that he would be overthrown by one of his god children.
Not like godchildren, but just children that happen to be gods.
When Rhea gave birth to the gods Demeter, Hestia, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, Cronus devoured them all. To thwart Cronus from eating their final son, Rhea gave birth to Zeus in secret and deceived Cronus into swallowing a stone instead of the baby Zeus. Once Zeus was grown, he poisoned Cronus, causing him to vomit the stone and all of Cronus's children. With the help of his god siblings, Zeus overthrew Cronus and the rest of the Titans, thereby fulfilling the prophecy.
Minority Report is a 2002 film directed by Steven Spielberg. It is loosely based on Philip K. Dick's short story The Minority Report, written in 1956. It's also the first movie I ever bought. I used a gift card at FYE. The film follows John Anderton, captain of the nation's first pre-crime program. Pre-crime is a new type of law enforcement in which enslaved individuals known as precogs predict murders before they happen. Because they are able to arrest every would-be murderer, the murder rate in Washington, D.C. has dropped to 0. Due to pre-crime's success, the Department of Justice sends Danny Whitwer to audit the program before it can be expanded nationwide. Shortly after Whitwer arrives, the precogs send out a brown ball, which indicates a premeditated murder.
This one's premeditated.
Amazing. Someone within 200 miles actually dumb enough to still do that.
The visions Anderton receives from the precogs indicate that in 36 hours, Anderton will kill a man he doesn't even know. Anderton goes on the run. We get some cool Spielberg, Tom Cruise action sequences before Anderton eventually makes it to the home of the inventor of pre-crime.
If the unintended consequences of a series of genetic mistakes and science gone haywire can be called invention, yes, then I invented pre-crime.
Real quick, this happens 1 hour into the movie, and we've still got 90 minutes left. This movie is long, but the pacing really works for me. There are few movies that I could watch for 2.5 hours without getting at least a little bored, and this is one of them. She tells him about the existence of minority reports.
Most of the time, all three precognitives will see an event in the same way, but once in a while, one of them will see things differently than the other two.
This, of course, has great implications for the integrity of the pre-crime program. If what we're seeing are visions of future murders, the existence of minority reports suggests that the future isn't certain.
I'm saying that every so often, those accused of a pre-crime might have an alternate future.
So because Anderton is convinced he won't kill Leo Crow, he is convinced that he has a minority report, an alternate future. He gets a black market eye transplant since the city is covered in optical scanners and breaks into pre-crime headquarters. He kidnaps Agatha, the most talented precog, and takes her to a black market hacker to extract her precognitions. He watches her vision of his future, but ultimately he doesn't have a minority report. He is destined to commit murder. What he does see is a vision of the murder of one Anne Lively. This is the second time he's seen this vision, the first being when he's showing Whitwer the precog tank. Accepting that he has no minority report, and determined to figure out why he would kill a man he's never met, Anderton drags Agatha to Leo Crow's hotel room. There they find a briefcase with photos of dozens of children, including Anderton's own son, who was kidnapped years before. Anderton resists the urge to kill, and in doing so, he reclaims his free will by arresting Crow in defiance of the precogs. Crow explains that this whole thing was a setup.
He called me in my cell. He told me I'd be released if I went along and my family would be taken care of.
If you did what? If you did what?
If I acted like I killed your kid.
But his family won't be paid unless he gets killed. He grabs Anderton's gun and shoots himself, which of course looks to everyone as if Anderton had committed the murder as predicted. Anderton and Agatha flee to the home of Anderton's ex-wife Laura, where Agatha reveals her backstory. She was the daughter of Anne Lively, a drug-addicted woman who sold Agatha to the pre-crime program. After becoming sober, Lively tried to reclaim her daughter, but was murdered. At that very moment, the pre-crime team drops in and arrests Anderton for the murder of Leo Crow. But he's not locked up for long before Laura springs him from the pre-crime prison. In the film's finale, we get the classic detective explaining the crime sequence.
So now you had to get rid of Anne Lively. You had to shut her up, which presented a problem. How can you kill her without the precogs seeing it? Simple. Use a system you control against her. So you hired someone to kill her for you, knowing full well the precogs would see that murder. You lured Anne Lively out to the lake with the promise of reuniting her with her daughter.
He then showed up to meet Anne Lively and carried out the murder himself. When this murder was seen by the precogs, it was dismissed as an echo of the first murder, so no one was sent to stop it. At pre-crime headquarters, a new vision is recorded in which Burgess kills Anderton. This leaves Burgess with a dilemma.
If you don't kill me, precogs were wrong and pre-crime is over. If you do kill me, you go away. But it proves the system works. Precogs were right.
Instead, he takes his own life. The pre-crime program is shut down, the precogs are liberated, and Anderton and Laura get back together. Now real quick, I want to make clear that I'm mostly going to be talking about the film adaptation in this video. The short story is a lot less dense. It really just boils down to the final dilemma of the film, except it's Anderton holding the gun. In the short story, there is one report that Anderton will kill a Leopold Kaplan. Ultimately, Anderton does kill Kaplan in order to preserve the integrity of the pre-crime system. It's kind of weird because both in the short story and in the film, Anderton understands that the existence of minority reports suggests that the system is flawed. But in the short story, Anderton kills a man to preserve this corrupt system. No wonder they call him Philip K. Dick. Given the themes of Minority Report and the whole science fiction thing generally, I want to look at this film through the lens of prediction. It's no secret that science fiction, particularly 19th and 20th century science fiction, predicted a lot of things about the modern world. Jules Verne predicted undersea exploration, H.G. Wells predicted cars and trains, and Isaac Asimov predicted artificial intelligence. So how did Minority Report do? Well, I'm going to break things into 4 categories. Right, wrong, probably not but too early to tell, and oh god we hope so. Since the movie takes place in 2054, we can't say for sure what it gets right and wrong, but we can make some educated guesses. So here's what they got right. Cops is still on the air. Also, everywhere you go, you get hyper-specific targeted ads. Stores keep track of your previous purchases and even greet you by name. We see ads everywhere, and advertisers are clearly doing the most to make their marketing as immersive as possible. Which brings us to our probably not category. Obviously, we're still decades away from the events of Minority Report. But do we really think there's going to be a United States in 34 years? Or capitalism? Or, for that matter, trees? We don't see a post-capitalist DC underwater because Minority Report takes place in a fantasy world where murders are virtually eradicated, especially those done by cops. Even when the movie's cops are face-to-face with someone they know will go on to commit murder, they only use non-lethal tactics. What a magical utopia! Obviously, there's still this big brother, a hyper-capitalist state, but cops not murdering people 34 years from now? A genderless child can dream. But what did the makers of Minority Report get wrong? Well, first off, we see a bunch of newspapers and magazines. Granted, those things are all animated to reflect real-time news, but it's also unusual that Anderton's apartment is fully automated and voice-controlled, but then somewhere like Laura's cabin seems totally low-tech. I mean, I get that not everyone wants a smart home, but even in 2020, the entry cost for this kind of automation starts below $50. I mean, all that Anderton has are smart lights and a routine that plays music when he gets home. This level of automation isn't particularly expensive, even in 2020. And yet, they don't even have electronic locks in Georgetown. And the thing that really jumped out at me, they're still using disc media with paper labels. Like, I get that maybe they use physical discs because they're government, and physical media is more secure than something cloud-based. But also, all of their security is biometric, so it seems like it'd be nearly impossible to hack into the system remotely. Especially if the infrastructure was isolated so that the data could only be accessed on the premises of pre-crime. Anyway, if security was really the reason everyone's using disk media, why not just use SD cards? They're smaller, stackable, and presumably more durable since they're not made out of an HD display. Ultimately, I think it just comes down to aesthetics. It's a movie, so it doesn't have to be that deep. The movie would be way less exciting if everything was cloud-based or if future cops used SD cards. Same with the newspapers and the low-tech homes. There wouldn't be much visual variety if everyone was just holding a smartphone or if everyone's home was just a giant Google Alexa. In science fiction, particularly in visual media like film, sometimes form is more important than function. I used to work in the museum world, and you know how many conversations I've had with clients where they say, you know that one scene in Minority Report? At least 2. But here's the thing, this interface is not terribly practical. Look at the range of motion required. Maybe for an athletic person like Anderton, this is a fine interface, but I assure you it is not ADA compliant. I mean, it's just irresponsible. And it seems to require a ton of precise dexterity. This guy is basically performing an intricate dance with his hands. So what happens if he's out sick? Is his second in command also a talented hand dancer? Or does he just use a regular computer? Because they do have more traditional desktop-style computers, all of which seem to be equipped with 3D projectors. But when someone says they want an experience like that one scene in Minority Report, it's not that the movie has made some bold prediction about the future of design. The movie has created this aesthetic, and the viewer is just drawing inspiration from it. It's easy to say that certain science fiction writers have predicted future technology, but when this technology comes to fruition, it's developed by people who already know these stories. But because our brains have developed the ability to recognize patterns to survive, this conflation of inspiration and prediction may be an example of apophenia. Apophenia is a phenomenon in which an observer perceives connections between unrelated things. If you've ever watched clouds, you've engaged in apophenia. Of course, clouds don't actually take the shape of animals or vehicles, but we project our own experiences on things that are totally unconnected. When the pandemic first hit, I thought maybe I was in hell. I can remember Tuesday, March 10th vividly. It felt different. It felt like I was living in the past, like I was in some sort of J.J. Abrams flashback. And sure enough, that was the last normal day I remember, because the next day my state announced its first COVID cases, and by the weekend, lockdown had begun in earnest. For me, a viral pandemic was and still is a nightmare scenario. I'm a socially anxious germaphobe, so the idea of a deadly illness that spreads through shared spaces and physical contact was a nightmare. Still is. Oh yeah, and our president is a white supremacist who's probably in the beginning stages of dementia. It just felt so precisely dialed into the things I fear the most. And since that time, things have only gotten worse. Cops continue to kill black people and get away with it. The government seems unwilling to do anything about it. Our best chance at saving the country is a white liberal who's probably also in the beginning stages of dementia. And his running mate is a former cop who has a history of anti-trans policing. And the president, who had always been friendly with fascism, has now fully embraced it. Climate change is getting worse, and people still reject science. The live music industry is just not a thing anymore. I lost my job. Twice. And beyond all that, I lost a parent to a cancer that was diagnosed too late. I mean, if you ask me to name the things I hate or fear the most, they would be in no particular order: white supremacy, fascism, dementia, capitalism, voter suppression, the ineptitude of neoliberalism, science denial, climate change, diseases not being caught until it's too late, diseases in general, public places, crowds, germs. I mean, come on. But then the president got sick. Now, first off, you're not going to make me feel bad. Whether or not Trump's illness is good for the country, it's hard to argue that he doesn't deserve it. I mean, it is not unreasonable to suggest that Trump is personally and professionally responsible for the death of at least 215,000 people in the US. And if you agree with that, it's not much of a leap of logic to suggest that someone responsible for so much death has earned at least one death of their own. Imagine there was a school shooting that killed, 215 people, and there was some good guy with a gun that took down the killer. Do you really think any far-right media pundits would be telling us not to enjoy the demise of someone responsible for so much death? And as far as being happy about people dying, I've already come to terms with that. I first tackled this when Bin Laden was killed. I lived in DC at the time, and as soon as we found out, we hopped on the metro and went down to the White House to party. But it felt weird. We were literally singing and dancing because someone died. Of course, I've grown since then. I'm no longer a hyper-pacifist, so I have no problem celebrating the death of evil men. And I'm guessing even the liberals among us have no problem celebrating the death of someone like Osama bin Laden. Now, I'm not saying Trump is as bad as bin Laden, but where's the line? Who is evil enough to warrant happiness in their death? So maybe your line for celebrating death is past Trump. But I don't think it's particularly unreasonable to be glad a man got sick if you can believe he's responsible for the death of 215,000 people by that same illness. But really, I think the biggest relief in the president's illness is how much it makes sense. As a news story, it feels so different from everything we've experienced so far this year. The person who refused to take precautions against the virus gets it. It just clicks. I've heard it called Shakespearean or even biblical. So if I'm experiencing a personal hell, this must be some profound happening. But then I think to myself, this isn't my personal hell, probably. My neuroses haven't predicted where we're at so much as they've been informed by the systems that are collapsing. And so calling 2020 a nightmare scenario actually feels like I'm giving it too much credit. It's more like a perfect storm. One of the main tenets of late capitalism is the idea of earning a living. And what do you need to live? Food, housing, healthcare, education, childcare. But the late capitalism of the US also leads to severe wealth inequality, meaning more people have less access to the necessities of life. And because of slavery, we still have the decidedly undemocratic electoral college, which gives rural areas a disproportionate electoral advantage. And because rural areas generate less capital, even though that's where our food comes from, they have less access to education. And people with less education are more likely to vote for a former game show host turned political con man. So we end up with an entirely incompetent president, and then a pandemic hits. And once everyone stopped going out as much and spending as much money, businesses had to lay people off. And in many cases, those people lost their health care. But not everyone got laid off. Since impoverished people with lower levels of education have fewer employment opportunities, they are more often in essential jobs, which are just public-facing service jobs. So the people with the least money and the worst healthcare are now at the biggest risk of being exposed to the virus. But because education is a commodity that not everyone can afford, a lot of lower income people are more likely to reject the science of COVID, meaning they're less likely to take precautions, meaning they're more likely to get sick. But again, their healthcare is probably not so great, so they are more likely to die, and if they don't, they probably have a ton of medical bills, or they avoid getting care because they know they can't afford it. In any case, they still need to earn a living, so they'll go back to their job, risking getting sick again or getting other people sick. But hey, Uncle Sam's got your back. Here's a big fat $1,200 check. Ooh, I bet in some places that'll cover rent for one of the 7 months that so many of us have been out of work. Meanwhile, cops continue to murder civilians and get away with it. So when the people who have been cooped up and out of work for months decide to protest those murders, the counter-protesters are, surprise, more cops, who are legally allowed to shoot at the people protesting them. And because we're in late capitalism, one of the most effective ways to protest is to destroy private property. But it's such an effective protest tactic for a reason, and so that's all the capitalists focus on. And not only are our cities burning, but so are our forests. Climate change is making natural disasters more frequent and more severe, but because of capitalism, we can't do anything about it. Wouldn't want a sustainable habitat for our species to get in the way of lower gas prices. And the fires are particularly hard to control this year because so much of California's prison-based slave labor is sick from the virus. And guess which type of people are more likely to be in jail because of that whole white supremacy thing? Then one elderly judge dies of old age and the whole federal government is thrown into chaos. Because for some reason we still have a council of elders made up of unelected judges who are all but guaranteed 1/9 of an entire federal branch of government for the rest of their lives. And there's virtually no barrier to entry for this council of elders. I mean, you can cry and talk about how much you love beer in your interview and you'll still get in. As long as you're the favorite of a former game show host turned political con man who was elected by a minority of the country. A minority which is so desperate to stay in power that they engage in all kinds of voter suppression to influence the upcoming election. And to top all of this off, the very unpopular and incompetent president has fallen ill with the virus he's been trying so hard to pretend doesn't exist. None of this is a coincidence, but it's also not some divine pattern. I mentioned before how the inspiration of science fiction sometimes prioritizes form over function, even though we all know function is more vital. This is reflected in the apophenia we experience with all the intersecting crises this year. It may look Shakespearean from the outside, but really it's just natural progression.
You're talking about predetermination, which happens all the time. Why'd you catch that?
Because it was gonna fall.
You're certain?
Yeah.
But it didn't fall.
You caught it.
By all accounts, Anderton's future murder seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like Cronus' defeat and the president's illness, Anderton's fate seems inevitable. His actions for the rest of the film are informed by the prophecy, but unlike Cronus, he is ultimately able to change his future. And just like the web of problems we face in the real world, his behavior has ripple effects for those he's wronged. His actions cause the dissolution of pre-crime. Since pre-crime is predicated on determinism, a vision from the precogs amounts to a felony conviction, whether or not there was an alternate future in which the killer never kills. Freeing all those that have been imprisoned effectively restores the free will to all the would-be murderers that Anderton has put away. As for his own crime, once Anderton is given the knowledge of what he can accomplish, he's able to reclaim his own free will and reject the notion of determinism. The filmmakers understood that determinism may be more poetic, but that's not the way the world works. In Minority Report, the state stripped away not only the liberty of its prisoners, but even their free will. And the injustice that was fundamental to the system is ultimately what brought it down. But free will or no, not even the most powerful person in the world can avoid the inevitable.